Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Mavis. I am 32 years old, and at my very own birthday dinner, my younger sister announced that she was pregnant with my husband's baby. Before I tell you exactly how I revealed a single truth that completely shattered their entire world, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments down below. I always love reading about where all of you are from. It makes me feel like I am sitting in a massive, comfortable living room with thousands of close friends, just sharing our lives over a cup of hot coffee. Let me take you back and set the scene for you so you can picture exactly what I was dealing with. They truly thought they were in complete control of the situation. It was a Saturday evening, and the air outside was crisp and chilly, the kind of autumn night that makes you want to pull your coat a little tighter. I was wearing a new black velvet dress that I had saved up my salary to buy specifically for this milestone occasion. We pulled up to the valet stand of the Ivory Room. For those of you who do not know, the Ivory Room was the absolute nicest, most exclusive, and incredibly expensive restaurant I had ever stepped foot inside in my entire life. We had to make reservations 4 months in advance just to secure a private table in the back. Walking into that restaurant felt like stepping into another universe. The ceiling was adorned with these massive, dripping crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, golden glow over the entire dining room. The floors were covered in thick, patterned carpets that muffled the sound of footsteps, and the tables were draped in heavy, crisp white linen that makes you terrified to even drop a single crumb of bread. I can still remember the rich smell of roasted garlic, expensive cuts of prime steak, and fresh white lilies filling the air around us. We were seated at a long, polished mahogany table near the back wall. All of my closest friends and my family were sitting around it, laughing, drinking expensive wine, and celebrating my 32nd year of life. My parents were sitting to my left, chatting away about their recent golf trip. My best friend Blythe was sitting across from me, looking radiant. And then, there was my younger sister, Sutton. Right after the waiter cleared our appetizer plates, these tiny, ridiculously expensive scallops wrapped in prosciutto, Sutton suddenly stood up. The scraping of her wooden chair against the floor caught everyone's attention. She smoothed down the front of her expensive silk blouse. Then, with all my friends and family watching intently, she placed her hand dramatically on her small bump, making sure the glittering chandelier light caught her every movement. My husband, Vance, immediately stood up and stepped right beside her. He leaned in and placed his hand gently on her shoulder, painting a perfect, disgusting picture of smug solidarity. I can still clearly see the lighting catching the silver watch I had bought for him just a few months prior to celebrate his recent promotion at his corporate finance firm. It was shining right there on the wrist of the very hand he was using to affectionately hold my sister in front of our entire family. "We are a family now," Sutton sneered. The words were carefully calculated. They were designed to act as a jagged dagger shoved straight into my heart. She made sure to say it loud enough so that the wealthy patrons at the tables next to us stopped their hushed conversations, lowered their forks, and turned their heads to look at our table. She fully expected me to crumble right there on the expensive, patterned carpet. She and Vance expected me to burst into violent tears, to scream at the top of my lungs, and to make a massive, embarrassing scene in front of the waiters and the distinguished guests. That is exactly what I was always supposed to do, according to their twisted narrative of who I was. In their eyes, I was always the emotional one, the fragile one who needed to be handled with extreme care and constant management. I looked over at Vance. He was looking back at me with that fake, pitying expression he had practiced in the bathroom mirror and perfected over the 5 years we spent married together. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes wide with a mock display of sorrow, waiting for me to break. The whole dining room seemed to instantly hold its breath, just waiting for the massive explosion of grief and anger from me, but that explosion never came. I just stayed perfectly silent. I sat there at the head of the table, feeling the soft velvet fabric of my black birthday dress against my skin, and I deliberately let the heavy silence hang in the air. It was a physical sensation, that silence. I could see my mother sitting 2 chairs down. Her jaw actually dropped, and her hand hovered over her water glass, completely frozen. My father looked back and forth between Sutton and Vance, his face turning a deep shade of crimson as the reality of the words processed in his brain. Blythe, sitting across from me, gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned completely white. The waiter who had been pouring sparkling water at the next table stopped mid-pour, the ice clinking softly against the glass before the room fell completely quiet again. I watched the micro-expressions on Vance's face rapidly shift. He blinked once, then twice. His eyebrows furrowed together just a fraction of an inch as he waited for my tears. Beside him, Sutton's smug, triumphant smile began to waver. Her lips twitched as the silence stretched from 3 seconds, to 5 seconds, to 10 seconds. They were waiting for the hysterical woman they had painted me out to be, but she was nowhere to be found. I reached down to the table and picked up my crystal wine glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Pinot Noir. I let the rich, dark berry taste roll over my tongue, completely undisturbed. I swallowed, feeling the warmth of the alcohol travel down my throat. I was deliberately letting the absolute silence stretch out until it became physically uncomfortable and suffocating for every single person in that room except for me. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a pan clattering all the way back in the kitchen. That is exactly how quiet it became around our table. The tension was so thick you could have carved it with a steak knife. Then, I slowly raised my glass directly toward them. A small, genuine smile played on the corners of my lips. They really thought this was their grand play. They truly believed they had cornered me into a public humiliation that would break my spirit forever. But they had absolutely no idea that I was the one who wrote the script for this entire evening. I was no longer the tragic victim they thought they were sacrificing on the altar of their own selfishness. To truly understand why they thought I would just break down and surrender to their cruelty, you have to understand how we grew up in our childhood home. Growing up, I was always forced to be the responsible one in the family. Sutton, on the other hand, was the golden child who could do absolutely no wrong in the eyes of our parents. I remember one specific spring during her junior year of high school. The air was getting warm, and the entire house was buzzing with prom preparations. Sutton decided she simply had to have this ridiculous, extravagant, custom-made princess dress for her school prom. We drove to this high-end bridal boutique downtown. I remember sitting on a velvet sofa, watching her twirl in front of a massive mirror in a cloud of pink tulle and silk. The saleswoman handed my mother the price tag. It cost over $1,000. My parents did not even hesitate. My mother smiled, pulled out her purse, and they actually drove down to the bank the next morning and cashed in a savings bond they had kept for years just to buy it for her without a second thought. They treated her desire for a sparkly dress like an absolute, life-altering necessity. But just 1 year later, my reality was entirely different. I was sitting at the kitchen table on a rainy Tuesday evening, staring at a syllabus for a college honors class I had worked incredibly hard to get into. I needed a specialized textbook that cost $300. I waited until my parents finished their dinner, and I politely asked if they could help me cover the cost. I did not receive a check. I did not receive a sympathetic smile. Instead, I got a long, drawn-out lecture sitting right there at the kitchen table about building character, the value of a hard-earned dollar, and getting a part-time job to pay for it myself. I remember looking at my mother, who was casually drinking her morning coffee and flipping through a home decor magazine, and I realized right then that the college fund they always bragged about to their friends at dinner parties was never actually meant for me. I was always the one who fixed things around the house. I was the one who was steady, completely reliable, and therefore, entirely taken for granted by everyone who claimed to love me. If the washing machine broke down, splashing water all over the laundry room floor, Mavis figured out how to clean it up and called a repairman while Sutton went to get her nails done. If the electric bill was late because my parents simply forgot to mail the check, Mavis quietly paid it from her own meager salary from her waitress job. They consistently mistook my unwavering stability for a lack of passion. They mistook my quietness for fundamental weakness. They assumed that because I carried the heavy loads without complaining, I did not feel the weight of them. That was their first, and ultimately their most fatal, mistake. The deepest betrayal, however, was not just about childhood money or parental favoritism. It was about the family Vance and I desperately tried to build. You see, Vance and I had been actively trying to have a baby for over 3 years. It was the one single thing I wanted more than anything else in this entire world. I craved it with a physical ache in my bones that kept me awake at night. We had a spare bedroom at the end of the hallway. I used to go in there, sit on the bare carpet, and just imagine where the crib would go. I bought a set of tiny, soft yellow baby socks on impulse during a grocery run and hid them in the back of my dresser drawer beneath my heavy winter sweaters. Every single month, on a specific Tuesday morning, I would lock myself in the bathroom and take a pregnancy test. I would sit on the edge of the bathtub, listening to the clock ticking in the hallway, staring at the plastic stick. When it inevitably came back with a single pink line, I would slide down onto the cold bathroom tiles and cry until my chest physically hurt. It felt like attending a tiny, devastating funeral in my own bathroom, mourning a child I never even got to meet. Going to my friends' baby showers and forcing a happy smile while holding their infants felt like absolute torture. Finally, after my endless pleading, researching, and crying late into the night, Vance agreed to go get tested. He drove out to a highly rated specialist clinic called Northwood all by himself one Tuesday afternoon. He told me he needed to do it alone to process it, to maintain his dignity. I waited at home, pacing the living room floor, chewing on my fingernails until they were raw. He came home that evening as the sun was setting. He walked through the front door, dropped his keys on the entry table, and put on the absolute performance of a lifetime. His shoulders were slumped, his face was drawn into a mask of deep sorrow. He walked into the living room, sat down heavily on the edge of the couch, pulled me into his arms, and held me tightly against his chest while I cried into his dress shirt. He was softly stroking my hair, acting like the perfect, supportive husband, telling me over and over that it was not my fault. "The doctor said it is not me, Mavis," he had whispered into my ear. His voice was thick with this horrible, fake sympathy that makes my stomach churn just thinking about it now. He said I am completely healthy. Everything is perfectly normal on my end. It must be you, honey. He sat there on our couch and let me carry that massive, crushing burden of guilt and inadequacy for an entire year. He watched me spend thousands of dollars on holistic fertility treatments. He watched me read endless articles about female infertility until my eyes were red and swollen. He let me believe that I was completely broken inside. That was a level of pure, unadulterated cruelty that I could not even process at the time. But he had absolutely no idea that his massive, suffocating lie was about to become his total undoing. The solid ground actually fell completely out from under my feet exactly 6 weeks before that fancy birthday dinner at the Ivory Room. It was a Tuesday evening. I remember it was raining outside, a slow, annoying, constant drizzle that made the whole house feel damp, dark, and incredibly isolating. I was standing in the kitchen, wearing my old comfortable gray sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, getting ready to cook a roasted chicken for dinner. I was chopping yellow onions and fresh rosemary on the heavy wooden cutting board. The sharp smell of the onions and the earthy scent of the herbs filled the warm air of the kitchen. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, reached over, and picked up the shared family iPad that we kept propped up on the kitchen counter. I just wanted to look up the exact roasting temperature for the chicken. As soon as I tapped the screen to wake it up, a new email notification popped down from the very top of the screen. It was an email sent from Sutton, delivered directly to Vance's personal email account, which was logged in on the tablet. The subject line was just 2 words, but those 2 words were enough to make the blood run completely cold in my veins. Our plan. I stared at the glowing rectangular screen. I knew I should not look at it. I knew it was an invasion of his privacy, and it felt exactly like standing on the extreme edge of a steep cliff, looking down at the jagged rocks far below, knowing that one step forward would change everything forever. My fingers were hovering over the glass screen, trembling slightly. The kitchen felt completely silent except for the sound of the rain hitting the window pane above the sink. I debated with myself. Turn it off. Put it down. Walk away. But the intuition in my gut was screaming at me. I had to know. I could not just swipe it away and go back to chopping onions. I took a deep, shaky breath, and I tapped the notification. I opened the email, and it was all right there in front of my face. The entire, disgusting affair was laid out in nauseating, explicit detail. The words blurred together at first, then came into sharp, horrifying focus. They talked about the specific hotel rooms they booked downtown. They mentioned the Tuesday afternoons they spent tangled together in bed while I was sitting at my office desk, working long hours to earn my salary to help pay for our mortgage. They joked about the lies they told me, laughing at how easily I believed Vance when he said he was working late on a project to secure his promotion. There were inside jokes. There were pet names. But it was the very end of the long email that made me physically ill to my stomach. It was a detailed, calculated plan to announce Sutton's pregnancy right at my upcoming birthday dinner. They wanted to use the shock, the grief, and the public humiliation in front of our entire family to break me down mentally. Their ultimate goal was to force me into a quick, quiet divorce where they could manipulate the situation, hire a shark lawyer, and take absolutely everything we owned. They wanted the house, the savings, the investments. They wanted to push me out the door with nothing but the clothes on my back. Sutton actually typed out the exact words, "Do not worry about Mavis. She will be too broken to fight back. She never fights back. She will just sign whatever we put in front of her to make the pain stop." I dropped the iPad from my trembling hands. It hit the hard kitchen tile floor, and the loud crack the screen made echoed the violent cracking I felt happening inside my own chest. I could not breathe. The air felt thick and useless in my lungs. I stumbled down the hallway, my vision blurring, until I reached the guest bathroom. I pushed the door open, fell inside, and locked the door behind me. I pressed my back against the cool wood of the door and slid down until I was sitting on the floor mat, bringing my knees to my chest as if that could somehow hold the entire world out. I did not scream out loud. I did not cry any tears. I just opened my mouth wide and let out a silent, ragged gasp as the entire life I thought I had completely evaporated into thin air right in front of my eyes. All the happy memories of our wedding day, the vacations we took to the mountains, the quiet Sunday mornings drinking coffee together on the porch, it all just turned to black ash. That was the absolute only moment of weakness I allowed myself to feel. I gave myself one long, agonizing silent scream on that bathroom floor. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, something fundamental shifted deep inside my soul. The heavy, suffocating grief that was pressing down on my chest suddenly stopped hurting. It hardened into something incredibly cold and sharp. It hardened into pure, focused rage. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling a little numb. I walked over to the bathroom sink and turned on the cold water. I splashed the freezing water on my face, letting it drip down my neck and soak the collar of my shirt. I looked at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My eyes were completely dry. There was no redness, no puffiness. I did not look like a woman whose heart had just been ripped out. I looked like a woman who was preparing for a war she fully intended to win. I walked out of the bathroom, stepping over the cracked iPad on the kitchen floor, and walked straight into my bedroom. I picked up my cell phone from the nightstand and scrolled through my contacts until I found my best friend, Blythe. Blythe and I had known each other since our freshman year of college. She was fiercely loyal, highly intelligent, and she worked as a senior paralegal at one of the biggest, most aggressive lawyer offices downtown. The phone rang twice before she answered. I could hear the faint sound of a busy office in the background. "Hey, Mavis," she answered cheerfully. "What is going on?" "Blythe," I said into the phone, my voice incredibly steady and calm. "It has happened." "What?" "No." "Mavis, where are you right now?" she asked, her tone instantly shifting from cheerful to laced with severe panic because she knew about the terrible suspicions I had been quietly harboring for months. "I am at home," I replied. I walked over to the bedroom window and looked out at the rain falling steadily on the street below. "Okay, I am coming over right now." "Do not do anything," she urged. "I am fine, Blythe. But listen to me carefully." "I am not going to cry," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "I am going to burn it all down to the ground." Over the next few days, I continued to live in the house with Vance as if absolutely nothing had changed. I cooked his dinners, I washed his clothes, and I smiled when he kissed my cheek before leaving for work. It was the hardest acting job of my entire life. Every time he touched me, my skin crawled. But my mind was constantly racing, connecting little dots that I had not even realized were there before. I sat alone in the dark living room late at night after he went to sleep, holding a yellow legal notepad, writing down dates, times, and excuses he had given me over the last year. I realized that the affair with my own sister was a terrible, unforgivable betrayal, yes. But it was just a symptom. The real disease was the constant, pathological lies, and the biggest lie of all had started well over a year ago. My mind kept going back to the fertility clinic. I looked at the notepad. Why would a man who was having an active, unprotected affair with his wife's sister suddenly agree to go to a fertility clinic? It did not make any logical sense. Unless, of course, the visit itself was a fabrication designed to throw me off his scent, or to assert control over my mental state to keep me docile and depressed. I remembered his award-winning performance on the couch. I remembered how he refused to show me the actual medical paperwork, claiming he had accidentally left the folder on the doctor's desk and that the doctor had simply told him the results verbally over the phone later. At the time, I was too devastated by the news that I was the problem to question his story. But sitting in the dark, with my newfound clarity, I saw the gaping holes in his narrative. The clinic visit was a lie. I was sure of it. But I needed absolute proof to destroy him in a custody battle over a child that might not even exist, or to protect myself in the inevitable divorce. I called Blythe again the next day during my lunch break. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot, watching people push their metal shopping carts through the rain. "Blythe," I said over the phone, tapping my fingernails against the steering wheel. "A few days ago, I asked you to think. I need the real, official medical results from Northwood Clinic from a year ago. Mavis, you know I cannot just call them up and ask for that. That is protected by HIPAA laws. Medical privacy is a literal fortress," she said, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. Blythe knew the legal rules inside and out. "I am his legally married wife," I said, my voice hard and entirely uncompromising. "I share his health insurance policy. There has to be a key to that fortress somewhere." There was, she replied slowly, a plan forming in her mind. It required a lot of digging. It took us 2 solid weeks of incredibly stressful work and phone calls. I spent my weekend secretly digging through dusty, spiderweb-covered boxes stacked in the very back of our garage while Vance was out supposedly playing golf with his coworkers. I was looking for old tax returns, life insurance policies, and any medical documents I could find. My hands were covered in dust, and the garage smelled like old cardboard and motor oil. I sifted through boxes containing old inheritance paperwork from his late aunt, old college essays, and broken electronics. Finally, at the bottom of a box from 3 years ago, I found exactly what I was looking for. I found a stack of signed, universal medical release consent forms that Vance had signed when we switched life insurance providers and needed a full medical workup. His signature was perfectly legible in blue ink at the bottom of the page. I scanned the documents and sent them to Blythe. Between those forms, my status as his wife on our joint insurance, and a little bit of clever, legally gray social engineering on Blythe's part where she utilized her firm's official fax machine to make an inquiry, the clinic finally processed the request. I was sitting at my desk in my home office when the email finally landed in my inbox. It contained a locked PDF attachment. Blythe sent me the password in a separate text message. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely control the computer mouse to click the file. The report slowly loaded on the screen. It was several pages long. I scrolled frantically past the complex medical jargon, the blood panel results, and the hormone levels, straight down to the physician's summary at the very bottom of the final page. The text was printed in bold, black letters. Patient exhibits zero sperm motility. Diagnosis: azoospermia. Sterile. The word just hung there on the bright computer screen, burning an image into my retinas. I sat back in my desk chair, letting the breath slowly escape my lungs. The implications of that single, medical word began to crash over me like massive ocean waves. He was completely sterile. He could not father a child. Which meant, without a shadow of a doubt, that the baby my sister Sutton was currently carrying in her womb was absolutely not his. She was cheating on her boyfriend, Gideon, with my husband, but the baby belonged to Gideon. Vance was not just a cheater. He was a pathological liar, and more importantly, he was a monster. He had willingly watched me suffer, watched me hate my own body, watched me mourn our lack of children, all while knowing full well that he was the reason we could not conceive. The lie was so clean, so total, and executed with such chilling perfection. It made me wonder what else he was lying about. That thought quickly became a relentless obsession. If he could lie to my face about something as profound and painful as my ability to be a mother, and if he could orchestrate an affair with my own sister, he could lie about absolutely anything. My mind went back to the day he had supposedly paid for those expensive fertility tests at Northwood Clinic. He had come home complaining about the cost. It cost thousands, he had said, complaining about the specialist consultations and the lab work that our insurance refused to cover. I walked back to my computer. It was time to stop looking at medical records and start looking at the numbers. It was time to follow the money, because monsters like Vance always leave a paper trail when it comes to cash. I opened a new tab on my web browser and logged into our joint bank accounts. I sat back in my desk chair, letting the breath slowly escape my lungs. The bright light from the computer monitor cast long, harsh shadows across my small home office. I had just discovered that my husband was completely sterile. The implication was massive. It meant the baby my sister Sutton was currently carrying in her womb absolutely did not belong to him. She was cheating on her longtime boyfriend, Gideon, with my husband, but the baby was undeniably Gideon's. My mind was racing. If Vance could lie to my face about something as profound and painful as my ability to be a mother, he could lie about absolutely anything. My thoughts immediately went back to the specific day he had supposedly paid for those expensive fertility tests at Northwood Clinic. He had come home complaining bitterly about the exorbitant cost. He had explicitly told me that the specialist consultations and the extensive lab work had cost thousands of dollars out of pocket because our health insurance refused to cover the procedures. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the cool wooden surface of my desk. It was time to stop looking at locked medical records and start looking closely at the numbers. It was time to follow the money, because arrogant monsters like Vance always leave a messy paper trail when it comes to cold, hard cash. I opened a new tab on my web browser and carefully typed in the web address for our primary bank. I entered my username and my password. I clicked the button to log in, and I sat there watching the little blue circle spin on the screen while the page loaded. When the dashboard finally appeared, I navigated directly to our joint checking and savings accounts. I downloaded the detailed PDF statements for the entire month surrounding his supposed clinic visit. I opened the document and began scrolling down the itemized list of transactions. I was looking for any payment made out to Northwood Clinic, or any medical billing service. I checked the day of his appointment. Nothing. I checked the day after. Nothing. I checked the entire week. There was absolutely no payment made to Northwood Clinic. Not a single dime had left our account to pay for any medical services. However, as my eyes scanned further down the page, my finger stopped moving the mouse. My breath caught in my throat. 2 days before his fake clinic appointment, there was a massive transaction. It was not a check, and it was not a wire transfer. It was a direct, in-person cash withdrawal. $25,000. I stared at the number on the screen. The zeros seemed to blur together. $25,000 in cash. That was a significant portion of the savings we had diligently built up using my hard-earned salary over the past 4 years. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My stomach clenched so tightly I felt physically ill. This was no longer just about a disgusting, secret affair between two terrible people. This was a calculated, financial decimation. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to Vance breathing softly beside me. The sound of his steady breathing filled me with a level of absolute rage I did not know I was capable of feeling. As soon as the sun began to rise, I quietly slipped out of bed, got dressed, and drove away from the house before he even opened his eyes. I had spent the early hours of the morning researching on my phone in the dark living room. At 9 o'clock sharp, I pulled my car into the small, cracked asphalt parking lot of a nondescript office building on the far side of town. The morning air was cold, and the sky was a dull, heavy gray. I walked up a flight of stairs that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap floor cleaner. At the end of the hallway, there was a door with frosted glass. The black lettering on the glass read, "Henderson Investigations." I pushed the door open. The office was small and incredibly cluttered. There were tall metal filing cabinets lining every single wall, and stacks of manila folders completely covering the wooden desk in the center of the room. Sitting behind the desk was an older man. He was wearing a faded brown tweed jacket and wire-rimmed reading glasses. He looked much more like a tired, retired librarian than a private detective. "Mr. Henderson?" I asked, stepping into the room and closing the door behind me. He looked up from his paperwork, adjusting his glasses. "That is me. You must be Mavis. Please, take a seat." I walked over and sat down in the stiff leather chair opposite his desk. I reached into my large leather tote bag and pulled out a thick yellow folder. I had spent hours organizing every single bank statement, every strange credit card charge, and every piece of information I had gathered. I slid the folder across the messy desk toward him. "I do not care if he is cheating on me," I told him, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "I already know he is sleeping with my sister. That is an established fact." Mr. Henderson raised a thick gray eyebrow, clearly surprised by my bluntness. Most people came into his office weeping and desperate for photographic proof of infidelity. "I need you to follow the money," I continued, leaning forward slightly. "I found a massive cash withdrawal of $25,000. I need to know exactly where that money went. I need you to uncover any hidden accounts, any offshore transfers, and any other money that simply does not add up. I am preparing for a very ugly divorce, and I need every single bullet you can find." He placed his hand on the yellow folder, nodding slowly. "I understand completely, Mavis. I will find the paper trail." They always leave a paper trail. The next 2 weeks were an absolute masterclass in psychological endurance. I had to continue living in the same house as Vance. I had to sit across from him at the dinner table, watching him chew his food, knowing he was actively plotting to destroy my entire life. I had to listen to him complain about his long hours at the corporate finance firm, knowing he was likely spending those hours in a hotel room with my own sister. I kept my mask perfectly in place. I smiled. I asked about his day. I did the laundry. I waited. Finally, my cell phone rang. It was Mr. Henderson. We agreed to meet at a small, quiet coffee shop near the public library. I arrived early and ordered a black coffee. I sat in a booth in the very back corner, watching the door. When Mr. Henderson walked in, he was carrying a thick, sealed manila envelope. He slid into the booth across from me and placed the heavy envelope gently on the table between us. "You were absolutely right to come to me, Mavis," he said quietly, taking a sip of the water the waitress had brought him. "It is much worse than you could have possibly imagined." I did not say a word. I just reached out, broke the metal clasp on the envelope, and pulled out the thick stack of printed papers. The first few pages detailed the destination of the missing $25,000. Mr. Henderson had successfully traced the cash to a hidden shell account that Vance had set up under a slightly altered version of his middle name. From that secret account, there was a steady, documented stream of monthly payments. I read the itemized list, feeling a hot wave of pure anger wash over my entire body. Vance was using our money that I had worked incredibly hard for, to completely fund Sutton's lavish lifestyle. There were regular payments covering the rent for her upscale downtown apartment. There were large transfers to a luxury car dealership for her new vehicle. There were thousands of dollars spent at designer boutiques for the expensive leather bags she constantly paraded around our family gatherings. I sat there in the quiet coffee shop, realizing that my own long hours at work, my own dedication, and my own sacrifices had literally financed my sister's disgusting affair with my husband. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I took a sip of my bitter black coffee to ground myself, and then I flipped to the final section of the investigative report. Mr. Henderson had placed a red sticky note on this particular page. "This is the final piece," he said softly, leaning across the small table. "This is the kill shot you were looking for." I looked down at the paper. It was a documented record of a single, massive wire transfer. The amount was staggering. $250,000. I read the line again, making sure my eyes were not deceiving me. $250,000 had been transferred directly out of Vance's corporate expense account at his finance firm. This was not his personal money. This was money he had brazenly embezzled from his own employer, likely using the elevated access he gained from his recent promotion. I followed the line across the page to see where the massive sum of stolen money had landed. The transfer went directly to a well-known commercial title company. It was the down payment for a brand-new, luxury house, Mr. Henderson explained, his voice low and serious. A house located in the gated community on the north side of the lake. I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. Why would Vance buy a house? He and Sutton were planning to force me out and take our current home. I scanned down to the very bottom of the page to look at the official property deed records Mr. Henderson had pulled from the county clerk. I saw the name listed as the primary legal owner of the new property, and the entire world simply stopped spinning. The air left my lungs in a sudden rush. The house was not in Vance's name. It was not in Sutton's name. The new luxury house was legally deeded in my mother's name. I dropped the heavy stack of papers onto the table. I pressed my hands over my mouth to stop the sob that was trying to tear its way up my throat. This was no longer just a betrayal by a cheating husband and a jealous sister. This was a massive, calculated conspiracy. My own husband, my own sister, and my own mother had sat down together and conspired to destroy me. My mother, who had lectured me about building character. My mother, who had gladly watched me struggle to pay for my college textbooks while she drained her savings for a prom dress. She was actively participating in a criminal fraud scheme to secure a luxury home for herself and her favorite daughter, fully expecting me to take the fall and walk away with absolutely nothing. Sitting in that coffee shop, looking at the undeniable proof of my family's total depravity, I realized something profoundly sad. This felt worse than attending a funeral. At a funeral, you mourn the physical loss of someone you love. But right now, sitting in this booth, I was mourning the death of my entire family tree. I was mourning people who were still alive, but who were completely dead to me. And that long, agonizing journey brings us right back to the present moment. It brings us back to the ivory room, the crystal chandeliers, the expensive white tablecloths, and the suffocating silence following Sutton's dramatic pregnancy announcement. I was standing at the head of the mahogany table, holding my glass of Pinot Noir. In my large black leather purse resting on the floor beside my chair, I held the two specific things that would bring their entire, carefully constructed world crashing down around them. I had the certified medical report from Northwood Clinic, and I had Mr. Henderson's devastating financial report. I looked at Vance, who was still wearing his fake, pitying expression, waiting for me to break down crying. I looked at Sutton, who was rubbing her small bump, expecting me to run out of the restaurant in absolute hysterics. I looked at my mother, who was sitting there silently, complicit in the plan to steal everything I owned. I stood up just a little bit taller, feeling the strength of absolute truth rushing through my veins. "To family," I said loudly, my voice ringing out with a startling clarity that seemed to surprise even me. The sound bounced off the crystal glasses and the high ceilings. "And to the truth." I took a final, slow sip of my wine and set the glass down onto the table with a firm, decisive click. I reached down into my black leather purse and my fingers found the crisp edge of a folded piece of paper. I pulled the single, folded piece of white paper out of my purse. I held it up for just a second, letting the bright chandelier light catch it, ensuring that every single person sitting at the long table could see exactly what I was holding. The silence in the dining room was now so thick it felt heavy on my shoulders. I lowered my hand and slid the folded paper straight across the polished mahogany table directly toward Vance. It glided smoothly over the wood, stopping right next to his expensive silverware. He looked down at the white paper, his perfectly practiced expression of pity instantly dissolving into a look of deep, genuine confusion. His eyebrows pulled together. He looked from the paper up to my face, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What is this?" he asked, his voice suddenly wary and cautious. He did not reach out to touch the paper. His instincts were finally warning him that something was terribly wrong with his master plan. "That," I said, making absolutely sure to project my voice loud enough for the entire table, and the surrounding tables, to hear every single word clearly, "is the absolute truth. That is your official medical record from Northwood Clinic from last year." I watched the color completely drain from his face in a matter of seconds. It was like watching a bucket of white paint wash over his skin. His tan complexion turned into a sickly, pale gray. He knew instantly. He did not even need to unfold the paper to know that his most guarded, disgusting secret was sitting right there on the table. Sutton looked from his terrified face over to mine, her triumphant, arrogant smirk finally faltering. Her hand, which had been resting so proudly on her stomach, slowly dropped down to her side. "The biggest lie was not you sleeping with my sister in cheap downtown hotel rooms, Vance," I said, my voice dropping an octave, sounding like absolute ice. "The biggest lie was you ever pretending for a single second that you could be a father." A collective, audible gasp went through the entire room. My father dropped his heavy linen napkin onto his plate. Blythe leaned forward, a fierce, protective glare in her eyes. "You see, Sutton," I continued, turning my cold gaze directly onto my younger sister. "Vance is completely, medically sterile. He has zero sperm motility. He cannot have children. Which means you are going to have a very difficult time figuring out custody arrangements, considering that baby absolutely belongs to Gideon." Sutton's face, which had been glowing with vicious victory just moments before, completely crumpled into a pathetic mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Her mouth fell open. Her eyes darted wildly over to Vance, then down to her own stomach, as the crushing reality of my words slammed into her. The baby she was using as a weapon against me was not even the weapon she thought it was. Vance started to stutter, stepping away from the table. You cannot do this. You have no right to look at my private medical files," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of intense panic and rising fury. But I was absolutely not finished. I had another bomb left to drop. I completely ignored Vance's pathetic sputtering. I turned my gaze away from him and looked directly down the table at my mother. She was staring at me with her mouth wide agape, her eyes wide with shock at the revelation of Sutton's true paternity. She thought she was watching the climax of the drama, completely unaware that the spotlight was about to turn directly onto her. "And Mom," I said, my voice softening just a fraction, dropping into a tone that was even more dangerous and terrifying than the anger I had shown Vance. She flinched slightly at the sound of her name. "That new house in the gated community on the north side of the lake is absolutely lovely," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead onto hers. "I really love the large windows in the living room." My mother's face froze. The shock regarding the baby was instantly replaced by a look of stark, naked terror. She realized I knew. She realized I knew everything. But, I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the silent restaurant. When Vance's corporate finance firm finishes their internal fraud investigation into the missing $250,000 that he blatantly embezzled to pay for that property, they are going to want their money back. I sincerely hope you have a good lawyer, Mom. Because they will likely come after your personal savings and your own inheritance to recoup the stolen funds. That was it. That was the second, fatal punch. I had effectively dismantled their entire conspiracy in less than 2 minutes, using nothing but the cold, hard truth. Absolute chaos erupted at the table. Vance completely snapped. The polished, corporate executive facade shattered into a million pieces. His face twisted into a contorted, ugly mess of pure rage and desperate panic. "You absolute witch," he screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with hysteria. He lunged aggressively across the wide mahogany table toward me. He knocked over crystal wine glasses, sending dark red Pinot Noir spilling across the pristine white tablecloth like fresh blood. He knocked over the heavy floral centerpiece, scattering white lilies everywhere. But before his hands could even reach the fabric of my dress, restaurant security was on him. 2 very large, burly men in dark suits materialized from the shadows near the kitchen doors. They grabbed Vance by his arms, hauling him forcefully away from the table. He thrashed wildly, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the table legs, screaming curses at me as they dragged him backward toward the front exit of the restaurant. It was the absolute perfect ending to my disastrous marriage. A highly public, completely humiliating, and incredibly well-deserved implosion for a man who thought he could destroy me in the dark. In the middle of the deafening chaos, as my mother started sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, realizing her financial ruin was imminent, and Sutton just sat there completely catatonic, staring blankly at the spilled wine, I calmly reached down and picked up my black leather purse. Blythe was already standing right by my side. She placed a firm, protective hand on the middle of my back, guiding me away from the wreckage of my family. I turned around and started to walk away. Suddenly, Sutton snapped out of her frozen stupor. She scrambled out of her chair and lunged forward, grabbing my arm. Her grip was tight and incredibly desperate. Her manicured nails dug into my skin. "Mavis, please," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Please, do not leave me like this. I did not know about the money. I swear I did not know he stole it." I stopped walking. I slowly looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then I looked back up into her terrified, tear-filled eyes. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No pity, no anger, no sisterly love. Just a profound, heavy emptiness. I firmly pulled my arm free from her grasp. My final words to her were not spoken in anger. They were not screamed. They were simply final. "I would save your pleas for the lawyers, Sutton," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. "And if I were you, I would pick up your phone and call Gideon right now. He deserves to know that he is going to be a dad." Then, I turned around and walked straight out of that incredibly expensive restaurant with Blythe walking right beside me. We walked through the lobby, past the staring hostess, and pushed open the heavy, brass-handled oak doors. The doors swung shut heavily behind me, instantly muffling the sounds of crying and the chaotic shouting of the terrible life I was permanently leaving behind. I stood on the sidewalk under the cool autumn night sky. For the first time in what felt like a very long time, I took a deep breath of fresh air, and I could actually breathe. The next 6 solid months of my life were an absolute blur of aggressive lawyers, endless stacks of legal paperwork, and cold, sterile courtrooms. But it was a necessary process. It was a clean, controlled burn that cleared away all the dead wood in my life. I am sitting in a local community pottery studio right now, located in a completely different part of the city. The studio smells wonderfully of wet earth, damp clay, and hot kilns. The afternoon sunlight is streaming in through the large industrial windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. My hands are completely covered in slick, gray, wet clay, and I am laughing out loud. It is a real, deep, belly laugh that makes my ribs ache in a good way. Blythe is sitting on a wooden stool right next to me, wearing an old oversized t-shirt. She is trying, and spectacularly failing, to center a stubborn lump of clay on her own spinning pottery wheel. The clay keeps wobbling violently, threatening to fly off the wheel entirely. So, Blythe asks, pushing a stray lock of hair out of her face with the back of her messy wrist, flicking a tiny bit of wet clay directly onto my cheek. Is the divorce finally, officially final? I wipe the spot of clay off my face with my shoulder and smile brightly. As of Tuesday morning, the judge signed the final papers. It is done, I say, feeling a massive weight lift off my chest just saying the words out loud. I did not have to fight hard for my assets. Once I presented the evidence of Vance's extreme financial crimes, his high-priced lawyers immediately folded. His corporate firm was terrified of the public relations nightmare. They settled everything with me incredibly handsomely. It turns out that massive finance companies really prefer not to have their dirty laundry and embarrassing lack of internal security aired out in a highly public, sensational court case. They gave me the house, the savings, and a substantial settlement to ensure my complete silence regarding the firm's oversight. Suddenly, my cell phone buzzes loudly on the wooden work table beside my pottery wheel. I wipe my hands clean on a rough towel and pick up the device. It is an automated news alert from a local city television station. The bold black headline flashes across the screen: former corporate finance executive Vance Peterson sentenced to 5 years in state prison for aggravated embezzlement. Below the headline, there is a grainy, unflattering photograph of Vance. He is wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, and his hands are shackled together in heavy metal handcuffs as a deputy leads him away from the courthouse steps. He looks exhausted, defeated, and significantly older. I stare at the photograph on the bright screen for a long, quiet moment. I wait for a surge of vindictive joy, or perhaps a twinge of lingering sadness. But I feel absolutely nothing. There is no joy. There is no profound satisfaction. There is just a deep, abiding quietness inside my soul. He is simply a dark chapter in a heavy book that I have already finished reading and closed forever. I put the cell phone face down onto the wooden table and turn my attention back to my spinning pottery wheel. Now, I say to Blythe, pressing my thumbs into the center of the wet clay, watching it begin to open up and take shape. Where exactly were we? I moved out of the old house. I bought a beautiful, bright new apartment on the top floor of a secure building. It has a small, private balcony with wrought iron railings that overlooks a calm, quiet lake. Sitting out on that balcony, sitting on a small ceramic table, I have a single, delicate orchid plant. I rescued that specific orchid from the dusty clearance rack at a big box garden store a few months ago. When I first brought it home, the plant was incredibly battered. The leaves were yellowing, the roots were dry and brittle, and all of its beautiful flowers were completely gone. It looked like it was ready to die. But I looked closely at the base of the stem, and I saw a tiny speck of bright green. I saw the life that was still desperately fighting inside it. Over the past few months, I have been carefully nursing it back to vibrant health. I researched the exact amount of water it needs, the precise amount of indirect sunlight it craves, and the specific type of fertilizer required to make it strong again. Early this morning, while I was drinking my coffee on the balcony, I leaned over to inspect the plant. Right there, near the very top of the curved stem, I saw a brand new, tightly closed green bud. It is preparing to bloom again. For a very long time in my life, during those dark years sitting on the bathroom floor taking those tests, I truly believed that I was the one who was fundamentally broken. I believed I was the damaged one, the one who simply could not grow or produce life. I let the people who were supposed to love me convince me that I was a barren, useless disappointment. But watching that tiny orchid bud fighting its way toward the morning sunlight, I finally understand the absolute truth. I was not broken. I was never broken. I was simply planted in the entirely wrong garden, surrounded by toxic soil that was actively trying to poison my roots. Now that I have pulled myself out of that dirt, I am finally free to grow exactly how I was always meant to. Thank you all so very much for taking the time to sit here and listen to my long, complicated story. It took a very long time to heal from the betrayals, and to be completely honest with you, I am still very much a work in progress. Some days are still harder than others, but every single day is better than the life I left behind. Before I sign off, I want to ask all of you wonderful people watching, have you ever had a specific moment in your own life that felt like a catastrophic, terrifying ending, but it eventually turned out to be the exact beginning of a beautiful new chapter? Please, let me know in the comments down below if my story resonated with you, or if you have walked a similar path in your own life. I read every single comment, and your stories give me incredible strength. I would be so incredibly grateful if you would take a quick second to give this video a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more true stories about surviving the unimaginable. It really, truly helps the channel grow and allows us to keep this amazing community going strong. Keep your heads up, remember your own incredible worth, and do not ever let anyone convince you that you are broken. I will see you all in the very next video.